Hi, I'm Kiing, the CEO and founder of the newly formed Kiing Foundation. I'm a part-time speaker and MC, a blogger and a YouTuber. I create platforms of expression, curating content that expresses the thoughts and the opinions of the youth, the Black, and the LGBTQIA plus community. Now, for those who do not know, October is marked in the South African calendar as Africa Pride Month. This is to commemorate and remember the 13th of October 1990, where the members of the LGBTQIA plus community, the ally and prominent political leaders marched the streets of South Africa, Johannesburg, making it the first ever Pride Month to be held in the African soil, marching for one word, and that is the word for freedom for all of those who live in South Africa and Africa as a whole. Yet it still saddens me that almost 3 decades later, queer people in the African soil are still fighting to be seen, to be heard, to be safe, and we are still fighting to be free. And this is all because of the lack of representation, the lack of platforms of expression, and the lack of education about the gender diverse people who live around us, with us, and some of those people being us. And that is why I bring to you the LGBTQIA plus lecture. Now, the LGBTQIA plus lecture is dedicated to educating people about the gender diverse people who live around us, with us, and some of those people being us. I understand that with education comes a better understanding, and with a better understanding comes respect, acceptance, and inclusivity for those who are very much marginalized. The LGBTQIA plus lecture will be covering the following topics: the explanation of the famously asked acronyms LGBTQIA plus, the history of the LGBTQIA plus community, a better understanding and the depiction of the queer life in 2023, and finally, the predicted queer life in the future. Whenever a conversation about the members of the LGBTQIA plus community, or queer people, or the gender diverse people, whatever you like to call it, whenever a conversation about us arises, there's always a misconception about how we choose to live our lives and about who we are. One would say, okay, it's a passing phase, while one would believe that we are possessed by a demonic evil spirit. One would think that it's probably a mental imbalance, while some will think it's an incurable illness. But all of these are misconceptions. This is how the world and the society has labeled queer people to be. But here we're talking about humans. Before any label, sithetha ngomuntu. Now, in the book of Genesis in the Bible, chapter 1, verses 27, I quote, God said, let us make a humankind in our own image, according to our likeness. And then it continues to say, so God created humankind in his own image of God, and he created them. He who is male, she who is female. Now, I want us to look at this. When they explain how God created people, before they attach a label of he male, she female, it says God created them. So before the label of being male, female, boy, girl, black, white, poor, rich, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, Before any label the society attaches to us, we should all know that we are all human and we all deserve the freedom and the right to exist. Whenever I speak about society and the attachment of labels, I talk about the spaces we constantly and each and every day find ourselves in. Our spaces like the homes we live in with friends and families, spaces like our workspaces, our schools, and the grounds where we get to practice our religions in, and the system as a whole. These spaces attach labels to us that make us conform to the social needs that are brought to us by the labels. Now, uxa sithetha ngomntu and the labels that get attached to someone, there are three commonly and prominently recognized labels eziye zohlule umntu, or labels that can get attached to someone. And with these labels, they indoctrinate people into an understanding of how they should be living and not allowing them to live in their free will. And these prominent labels that are given to people will be: 1, the sex of the person; 2, the gender identity of the person; and 3, the sexual orientation of the person. Now, when we talk about humans, we talk about people that are created in a magnificent manner that is different from any other creature that lives on earth. Humans are made with a distinct DNA, that each and every human has a different DNA from the other. It is said that even a set of twins has a different DNA from the other twin. Now, when a mother is pregnant with a child, we can get to identify the sex of the child with what we call chromosomes. So, a male child will be identified with the XY chromosomes, while a female child is identified female with the XX chromosomes. And then we have the third gender, or the third sex, which is the intersex, something that we're going to be talking about later on during the lecture. Now, with this first label, which is the sex of the child, be it male or female, we can get to distinguish what label is next we are yet to attach to a child, and that is the gender identity. Just because a male child is XY chromosomes and they identify as male, we as the system automatically believe that a boy child will wear blue while a girl child wears pink. A boy child plays soccer while a girl child plays with dolls. These are social contrasts to characterize the traits of a humankind. So we automatically create this illusion and this narrative in the human head, that because you are male, you are a boy, and this is how you should conduct yourself. Because you are female, you are a girl, this is how you should be conducting yourself. And then the third label is the sexual orientation. Now, the sexual orientation is a sexual preference or a sexual desire, be it whoever you want to date or someone you want to be intimate with. Now, because you are a boy, you are expected by society to be intimate with a woman. And because you are a woman, you're expected to be intimate with the girl. These are the three labels that get attached to humans and to indoctrinate humans in a certain system or a manner of living.
occasion. Inclined and enthralled with a sudden sensation to place myself right in the middle of these festivities said to be prideful. Lined with 6 colors meant to represent inclusion, so pardon the intrusion, but where is the color black?
It was the lack of representation, the lack of the platforms of expression, the lack of education, the system, and the labels that are attached to people that still find continents like Africa still killing, criminalizing, and harshly punishing the queer people for living their lives. These are the same queer people who can be found in the African soil and in the African history that are still not free in Africa. If one is to say queer is not African, then that person is simply not African. Because in order to be African, you need to find inclusivity in diversity. And in that way, you get to find Ubuntu. Now, countries like Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Uganda, these are the few countries in Africa that still do not tolerate or accept and not inclusive of people who are gender diverse. We have countries like your Egypt who holds the oldest documentation of queer activities. The documentation of Nyakum Kunam and Kunam Hotep, who served in the 5th dynasty under Pharaoh Nuresere. These documentations show these 2 men embracing each other with their nose touching one another. That was a symbol in Egypt of kissing. These 2 men were buried in the same tomb as though they were spouses, because in Egypt, spouses were the only 2 people that could be buried in the same tomb. And then we have countries like Cairo. Cairo holds the oldest documentation of traditional homosexual activities, which is cross-dressing. Cross-dressing was used to entertain guests and prominent figures in Cairo, and this was called Kawali. And then in the West of Africa, we can find that gender identification was only given, or gender identity rather, was only given to children when they reached adolescence or puberty. So when a child would start growing breast, a female child would start growing breast and start their menstruation cycle, then they will be then given a gender that, okay, she is female. Or if their attributes or personality is showing otherwise, then they will be given a sex or a gender identity of being whatever personality or attributes they possess. And then we have countries like your Zimbabwe, who holds 2,000-year-old painting or documentation of intimate men, or men enjoying themselves in intimate pleasures. And then we have countries like Uganda. Or a country that was once named Buganda, was ruled by King Kabanga Mwanga II. Now, King Kabanga Mwanga was a bisexual man who enjoyed cross-dressing from head to toe. He was married to a woman, but he enjoyed sexual pleasures with a younger man. And in the Zande tribe in Uganda, the boys between the ages of 12 to 20 who are more in touch with their feminine side, or one would say were a bit too soft, these boys would practice wife duties. And then we would come to South Africa and get to see that the entire continent of Africa, from the north to the south to the east to the west rather, has a documentation of queer activities. Because in South Africa, one of the first people to arrive in South Africa were the Khoi people, then joined by the Zulu, the Pedi, the Nguni tribes, and many other tribes that followed. It is noted that in the late 50s, men who worked in the mine used to enjoy sexual pleasures with young men, and young men who would then travel to the mines to help their families would be turned into boy wives. So they would do wife duties while the men are working in the mines. The boys who would be staying at the hostel would start to do cooking and cleaning, and then when the men arrive, would not only enjoy the cooked meal and the clean house, but some would enjoy sexual pleasures with these young men. In the prime of the 60s, a new law was put to place in South Africa, and this was the sodomy law. Now, the sodomy law prohibited men on men sex and women on women sex, or any sex that would prevent reproductivity. So if there were condoms back then and you were to be found to be having sex using a condom, that would be considered unlawful. I know, right? Now, it was in the 60s, and in the mid 60s to the late 60s, then the peak of the witch hunt in the South African Defence Force started. Now, the witch hunt was hunting down all queer men and all queer women in the South African Defence Force. If those queer people would be found, then they would be taken to a psychiatric facility where they'll be treated for a mental imbalance, rather, or fortunately for white people, if they were to be found queer, they would then go under a sex change, what we call now a transgender treatment, right? So these are the things that were found to be happening to queer people in the early 60s, late 60s. Now, many South Africans would know that the 70s and the 80s were the peak and the heat of the apartheid regime. And this found many South Africans coming together and fighting for freedom, freedom for all who live in South Africa. And queer people were amongst the people who are in the forefront fighting for freedom, not only for South African, but freedom for queer people too. People like your Simon Koli, Beverly Dintsey, Justice Edward Cameron, and organizations such as the Organization for Lesbian and Gay Activism, Exit Magazine, and the ANC. These were some of the prominent people and organizations that fought not only for South Africans, but for queer South Africans to be seen, to be heard, and to be also free in South Africa. It is said that in the 80s, the ANC was the first political formation to commit itself to a Bill of Rights that was later on released in the 90s in November. It is said here it was a reflection of what South Africa could be. The political formation spoke of the constitutional democratic political order that included everyone who lives in South Africa, that they will all be protected equally by the law, regardless of their skin color, their gender, their religion, their political opinions, or sexual orientation. Then in 1996, South Africa's constitution, post-apartheid, became the first in the world to outlaw the discrimination based on sexual orientation. In 2002, South Africa legalized or granted same-sex couples to have joint or stepchild adoption. And then 2003, the following year after that, the change of gender identity was then permitted or legalized in South Africa. And in 2006, now 2006, I remember this one because I was still young and I think I was aware of what I was and what I wanted later on in life. In 2006, same-sex marriage was made legal in South Africa. And I remember the opposing questions and conversations that were against, rather, the same-sex marriage in South Africa. It made me think if what I was right and what I wanted and what I felt was the right thing to feel. So I remember when this one was implemented or acknowledged in South Africa, the same-sex marriage, when it was made legal in South Africa. Now, for each and every era, each and every decade, each and every century, there is a popular culture that takes place to shift the narrative, to start conversations. And queer people have always fought to earn their space, for their voices to be heard, and to leave behind a historical mark each and every era with each and every culture that comes through. And this is usually done by queer people in the arts and entertainment space, where they get to fully express themselves, their thoughts and their opinions in a art manner or in an entertainment space. In 1912, the only medium of communication was through literature, be it writing, be it reading. So a lot of letters were used to communicate, a lot of newspapers were used to communicate, and magazines were some of the tools that were used to communicate. Like the Mormon magazine. The Mormon magazine is said to be the first documentation of queer expression. A young lady paid homage to Seppo of Lesbian. This was a Greek poet of 630 BC who was considered to be lesbian, and this was in reflection of her poetry, because some of the wording she used was a reflection of who she was. So she would have her them and theirs, and touch on topics or conversations in her poetry that would enlighten people about the gender diverse people. Fast forward to 1919. Now, 1919 was the release of a movie that spoke about the queer movement in Germany, and the movie was titled Different from the Others. Now, this movie was one of the first movies to be documented as a movie that spoke for queer people, about queer people. And in 1939, Francis V. Ramero stirred the conversation with his book, which was titled Diana the Strange. This book also helped to stir conversations about the gender diverse people who were living in the society, and this was a form of expressing the side and the things that queer people had experienced through the life of the person that they wrote about, which was Diana. This was an autobiography on Diana, and it was titled Diana the Strange. And then in 1950, the first ever gay men's rights society was formed in America. The Matthian Society was formed by Harry Hay in the United States of America. Then fast forward to 1952, One Magazine became the first gay magazine to be used rather as a tool of expression, expressing the thoughts and the opinions of queer people. Then coming to Africa, and particularly South Africa, in the 80s, that was then, or there was the time rather, where the conversation about queer people was starting to be a conversation with your Simon Collies and your Beverly Jeanses and other organizations that didn't only speak for the freedom of South Africans, but spoke for the freedom of queer people in South Africa. So we had organizations that spoke for queer people, magazines like your Exit magazine, that spoke for queer people. And then in the early 90s, in October 13, 1990, South Africa became the first land in Africa to gather queer people from all walks of life, queer people from across the seas, and queer people in Africa, prominent figures in the society, political leaders and organizations, and the ally, they came together to have the first ever Pride Month in Africa and in South Africa. This was held in Johannesburg, and it was a march for freedom, freedom for South Africans, freedom for queer people. And this was attended by a lot of people, and it caused a stir because it was documented. And not only documented, but there were religious people and traditional leaders who were against this march, believing that it was in support of the ill doing, or the support of the evil spirit that has possessed Africa. 2006, right after the presentation, or when South Africa was told that we are now accepting same-sex marriages, one of the biggest entertainment platforms, a soapy that was big and known in South Africa, Isidingo, showed the first ever same-sex couple scene on TV. And this was received by South Africa very, very terribly, because it was then we got to see these two white males who were in character of being queer partners or gay partners. Their scenes were limited, understanding that they are introducing something new to the scene, but at the same time, because of what the society said about the scene, we got to get small scenes of these two couples. And I, I think I'm not really sure because I was still young, but I think the scenes were shortened, and not only shortened, but the storyline of these two queer people was just a brief one on the screen. And then fast forward to 2009, Generations, which was then South Africa's most watched TV program, and now is the second most watched TV program on TV, came closer to the majority of South Africa, having two straight looking black men interacting in a queer activity. And this was the notorious or the famous Senzo and Jason character that was in Generation. Now this one had everyone talking. I remember there were conversations about this topic on the streets, in our households, even in our church, and everywhere. Everyone was speaking of Senzo and Jason, and each and every queer person would be called Senzo or Jason because of this powerful shift that didn't only speak to the queer people, but spoke to the black people, saying that yes, we are educating you guys about this gender diverse people. It's not a white people thing, but it is also a black people thing, and it's for everyone. They started conversations, and as I said, and they opened a room for queer people to fully express themselves and what they were going through. And this was all held by the popular culture of their time, because media holds so much power in the popular culture. And for queer people to be able to express themselves in that sphere, that means a lot for queer people, and for us to be able to teach people about us, because at the end of the day, we are all human, and people need to know that we are all human and there's nothing wrong with being queer. After all the success, after all the achievements queer people have brought to the continent of Africa and South Africa, it saddens me that we are still seen sitting at the bottom of the human hierarchy as the members of the LGBTQIA plus community. We're still finding countries in our continent that still believe that being queer is a sin, it's an illness, you're possessed by evil or demonic spirit, it's a curse. We're still finding parents that are rejecting their children for being queer. Some queer people are being killed. Some queer people feel unsafe. Some queer people are being punished physically, or they have to pay a fine for being queer. And we still are insulted for being ourselves. You walk down the street and you find children laughing at you, mocking you for being you and for living your life. And the rate of queer people who commit suicide, the rate of queer people who find themselves in, say, psychiatric wards and facilities, queer people that are suffering from mental health issues because of what society tells them, keeps on increasing. And here we are in South Africa, almost 3 decades into our democracy, and we have a law that liberates all who is South African. But we queer people still find ourselves not free and not safe in our country. Whenever queer people get to express themselves, we are always seen as dramatic. Queer people are deprived of platforms where we get to be ourselves and express ourselves, express our knowledge, express our talents. We are only boxed in this box of entertainment. We're still doing what was done back then, where queer people would cross-dress just to entertain people, where queer people would be in a space just for that space to come alive. That's what the society is using us as an object to entertain, an object to bring light and color, forgetting that queer people can be doctors, queer people can be scientists, queer people can be traditional leaders, queer people can be presidents. And they've indoctrinated us into the system of what the society wants us to be. To every queer person, we have a voice and our voice matters. There are many other spaces for us queer people to feel, and the media should show more programs, more ads, and have a queer narrative in everything that they get to put out, because the society has queer people in them, in it. To the queer people, particularly queer, Black, young people, you have a voice and your voice matters. Be yourself and do you. Don't allow the people around you to tell you how to be, how to act, and who you are. Media platforms need to start channeling programs that expresses a queer narrative, from our adverts to the stories we read to the education that is given to the children at school. It needs to be education that teaches them holistically, teaching them about the gender diverse people that live with these children at home, in our communities, and some of those people being these children. Growing up knowing who you are gives you a better chance of growing and attaining your goals. Because the problem we're facing as queer people now who are in our late 20s, early 30s, mid 30s is the fact that we are now only becoming ourselves. And it has an effect and a bad effect in who we are today. And if we get to teach children at the prime of their lives about the people they live with them, then they can easily understand, respect, and accept those people. If we teach these children about the people they are, if we teach these children and make them reflect on who they've grown up thinking they are, and they get to believe that this is me and there's nothing wrong with being who I am, then we're raising a generation that is self-aware, and instead of searching for themselves, they know who they are and they know what they want, and they strive for that. And the world needs to start learning and opening their minds to a new understanding and start respecting and accepting queer people for who they are. I do see us queer people in spaces of leadership in the future. I do see us obtaining each and every opportunity that is presented to us, grabbing it by both hands and owning it, like we've owned everything else that the society has said to us we can't own. Everything that the society has said to us that we can't own, even the freedom that they say we do not have, we one day are gonna hold that freedom, because freedom is ours. So is life that we are living. Our birthright is to live our lives the best way we know how, without the barricade that's protecting us from the outside world. We can protect ourselves. Because I find a lot of spaces and a lot of families and a lot of loved ones who tame us from being ourselves, because they say that they are protecting us from the world outside, and they're depriving us from platforms that allow us to be ourselves, platforms where we can get to express ourselves, platforms where we can grow into knowing ourselves and being comfortable with ourselves. We have the power and the future in our own hands. We have the key to access our better life. And those around us have the key too. And that is through education. If we create more platforms like this where we get to educate our families, our friends, in the little conversations we have in our corners, then it will cause a ripple effect that will educate the entire society and open their minds to a more colorful world. A world that is not just black and white, boy and girl, female or male. A world that is filled with colors.